Well, welcome to day two, sailors, of our reading unit. So, taking a look, we're going to start off with our 10 minutes of independent reading time. So, get that independent reading book out. Right now, I'm currently reading Blended, which is an excellent read. I highly recommend it. And so, while you're reading, keep this in mind. What can you infer about your main character? So, maybe it's something about their personality. Maybe it's something about what they like, what they dislike. So, what is something that you can infer about them? All right. So, get comfy, open up those books, and enjoy the next 10 minutes of independent reading time. All right. Hopefully, you had a good little chat about the things that you're currently reading. We're going to do a little bit of context clue practice. So, right now, we're going to go to turn this over to Mr. Cheney, and he's going to do a little context clue practice before we get into our story, where you're going to have to be taking some notes on context clues and taking some notes on inferencing. So, let's turn it over to Mr. Cheney and do a little bit of that context clue practice that we did yesterday.
Between Joshua and Maddie. Joshua says, "That was uproarious in Mrs. Huffman's class. I've never laughed so hard in my life." Maddie said, "That was so funny. I had thought Alex would have been embarrassed, but he wasn't." Alex doesn't care what people think. I'm not astonished that he wasn't embarrassed. No, you're right. I would have been embarrassed, but it isn't shocking that Alex wasn't. Okay, so we're trying to use the context clues to help us find out what uproarious means and then astonished. So uproarious.
All right, so take a second and jot down on a piece of scrap paper or a whiteboard, what do you think uproarious means? A, B, or C? Do you think uproarious means boring? Do you think it means shocking? Or do you think it means hilarious? And then we'll see how Mr. Cheney explains it. Same with number 3 here. What does astonished mean? Just jot down a quick answer. Do you think it means angry? Do you think it means surprised? Or do you think it means annoyed? Remember, we're trying to figure out how it's used in the sentence. What do you think it means?
So uproarious doesn't mean boring, shocking, or hilarious. In the context, that was uproarious. I never laughed so hard in my life. Definitely not boring. Maybe shocking, but if you never laughed so hard in your life, that means it's hilarious. For astonished, Alex doesn't really care what people think. I'm not astonished that he wasn't embarrassed. Okay, so astonished. Okay, so astonished might mean angry, surprised, and annoyed. When we are looking at the context clues, it isn't shocking that he wasn't. This is a little confusing, but in this scenario, astonished means surprised. Okay, if you're astonished, it completely blows your mind. Okay, so normally it embarrasses people, but in this case, Alex was not embarrassed, and that's why it was shocking. Okay. As we move on to our second cell phone conversation between Samara and Edgar, we'll read the passage. Samara says, "I'm sorry, I was so despondent earlier. I've just got a lot going on." Edgar says, "Please don't apologize. I was just worried to see you were so upset. You're such a great friend. I appreciate you consoling me earlier. I'm okay now. I'm glad to hear that. You are doing better. I'm always here for you if you need me." Okay, so in this scenario, despondent. Okay.
All right, so let's pause a second and take a minute. What do you think despondent means based on how it's used in the sentence? Does it mean furious, bored, or sad? Jot down a quick response. What do you think it means? Do the same thing for consoling. What does consoling mean? Does it mean comforting, bothering, or moving? And then let's listen to Mr. Cheney explain the answers just and see how you're doing. How are you doing at figuring these out? Are you getting them right?
Okay. Samara's apologizing for being it. She says she has a lot going on in her mind. Okay. So, and Edgar says, "Please don't apologize. I was worried to see you're so upset." So if he was worried you were upset, the word that matches upset up here is sad. So despondent means you are sad. Okay. And the second word we're looking for is consoling. Okay. I appreciate you consoling me earlier. Okay. Comforting, bothering, or moving. Okay. But I'm okay now, as the context clues. And then Edgar says, "I'm glad you're doing better. I'm always here if you need me." So in this scenario, consoling means comforting. So if you console someone, maybe they just had something happen bad to them and you're being there, you're listening, and you're comforting them. All right, that's all for today.
Welcome back after doing a little context clues practice. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to get into our story after 20 years. And just like our video clip that we watched yesterday, called Snack Time, where we met a couple of characters and we learned a little something about it and then had a surprise ending. So does our story after 20 years by O. Henry. So right now I'm going to ask that you get out those notes from yesterday. So they look like this. You were working on them yesterday. If you're virtual, you're using a digital copy and you're going to be working right along on the digital copy. If you're in person, you should have a hard copy, so you'll need something to write with. And today we're going to be working in this context clues area as well as in this making inferences area. These are our two main focuses as we are reading today. And I'll be working through this with you as we go through, but there's going to be times where you're going to be asked to stop, read on your own, and complete some of these words on your own. If you're at home, you're going to, or at school, you're going to want to be sure and open up the document after 20 years. You will find that on your Google Classroom. If you're virtual, you can find it right here as well as on your Google Classroom. So go ahead and find that link, open up after 20 years, and have this document in front of you. Teachers, go ahead and pause so that students can get their supplies ready. All right, we're ready to get into our story after 20 years. So go ahead and open up that document and make sure that you have your copy of the notes because we'll be taking notes as we go along. All right, here it is, After 20 Years by O. Henry. So I'm going to start us off reading this, and we're going to stop along the way and try and figure out what some of these different words mean. So let's get going right away on the story. Okay, here we are, After 20 Years by O. Henry. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The impressiveness was habitual and not for show, for spectators were few. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had well nigh depeopled the streets. Looking at this first passage, just as we look at it, what do you think the word habitual means? So it's our first word right here on our notes. Habitual. What do you think it means based on how it's used in the sentence? So, right now, what do you think habitual means? The impressiveness was habitual and not for show, for spectators were few. You should see another word inside it. You should be noticing the word habit. So, thinking of the word habitual and the word habit, right here, it's a habit. It's something that he just does naturally. So as he walks impressively, it's just natural for him. Let's continue to look at this police officer as he walks the beat. Walking the beat is his route, his routine. And when it says spectators were few, that means there weren't very many people out. And it was 10 o'clock at night. But that chilly gust with a little bit of rain made it so that it had depeopled the street. So what do you think depeopled means? That's a word you definitely don't hear. So what do you think depeopled means? We'll put that one down right here. Give you a second. If you said that there were no people, you are correct. So that's what we're going to be doing with context clues. You'll see these words as we come to it. You're going to want to put in, what do you think that word means? Let's continue on with our story. Trying the doors as he went, twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements, turning now and then to cast his watchful eye down the Pacific thoroughfare, the officer, with his stalwart form and slight swagger, made a fine picture of the guardian of the peace. The vicinity was one that kept early hours. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store or of an all-night lunch counter, but the majority of the doors belonged to business places that had long since been closed. So you should see this police officer. He's walking up and down the streets of New York City about 10 o'clock at night, twirling his police club, checking the doors to make sure that they were all locked. Looking at the next word, stalwart. What do you think that means? It's obviously describing his form, the way he's walking. So what do you think it means? Take a second, jot down what you think it means, and then we'll go over it. All right, so some of you might have put down that he had a really professional looking form, and that would be absolutely correct. It might be professional, it might be straight up and hardworking. So he looks very professional, and it's just who he is and how he carries himself. What do you think vicinity means? Vicinity here, it says the vicinity was one that kept early hours. So, what do you think vicinity means? Write down a quick answer. A lot of times, this one seems to be one that a lot of students know. So, what do you think that one is? If you said the area, the location, the neighborhood, you're correct. The vicinity is the area. So that area is one that keeps earlier hours. So most people at 10 o'clock at night are in bed and all the shops and doors are all closed and locked. All right, let's continue on with our story here. So this policeman, he's walking the beat, he's checking the doors, and the only thing that's opened, it might be a cigar store or an all-night lunch counter. When about midway of a certain block, the policeman slowed his walk. In the doorway of a darkened hardware store, a man leaned with an unlighted cigar in his mouth. As the policeman walked up to him, the man spoke up quickly. So try and picture this. There's a guy just standing in this darkened doorway with a cigar in his mouth. And the policeman walks up to him, and the guy instantly starts talking. "It's all right, officer," he said reassuringly. "I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment made 20 years ago. Sounds a little funny to you, doesn't it? Well, I'll explain if you'd like to make certain it's all straight. About that long ago, there used to be a restaurant where this store stands. Big Joe Brady's restaurant." "Until 5 years ago," said the policeman. "It was torn down then." The man in the doorway struck a match and lit his cigar. The light showed a pale, square jawed face with keen eyes and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. His scarf pin was a large diamond, oddly set. Let's take a look at some of the things that we have come in contact with here. All right, the first one we're going to take a look at is the word keen on your chart. So let's take a look at keen. So right here, keen, what do you think the word keen means? Using some context clues. It said, the light showed a pale, square-jawed face with keen eyes and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. His scarf pin was a large diamond, oddly set. So take a second, what do you think keen means? And jot down an answer. All right, so if you said keen, here what makes the most sense is to have really sharp eyes. These sharp eyes that are really, they notice a lot of detail. So sharp or focused, highly focused eyes. So this guy's standing in the dark in that darkened alleyway talking to this police officer as soon as the police officer shows up. We're going to make a couple of inferences here. So let's look at the inferencing side now. So we're just going to pause a second and take a look at this right here. It says the policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The impressiveness was habitual and not for show. That's the thing from the text. But right here, what can you tell me about the policeman based on this? What kind of guy is this policeman? What's important to him? What does he value? What can you infer about him? So take a minute and jot down a little inference. What can you infer about him? And then do the same thing right here for the man in the doorway. Based on this description, what can you tell me about this guy? The lights showed a pale, square-jawed face with keen eyes and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. What can you tell me about this man in the doorway? Based on his description, what kind of guy do you think he is? So take a second and jot down a little, what do you think, what does this tell us about him? What can you infer about these guys? And then we'll talk about it. All right, so here's some things that I can infer just from looking at this police officer. I can infer right here that he's a proud man. The way he carries himself it shows that he's very proud of who he is. He values his job. I mean, his impressiveness is just something he does naturally. So he's proud, he values his job. It looks like he's probably very confident in his job and his ability to be a police officer. Now let's look at this guy. Based on what we've seen here, he's in a darkened alleyway and he's got these keen eyes and he's got a scar above his eyebrow. Based on that, I think that this guy, he might have been into some violence. He's got a scar there. He seems a little shady, hanging out in the darkened alleyway or the doorway. Nobody else is around. As soon as the police officer comes, he starts talking right away. So he seems a little shady. Maybe he's a little guilty acting right there. So those are some things that I feel like I can infer when I look at this guy. All right, let's keep going. Now that you know what to do in both of these charts, I'm going to be asking you to do them as we go along. 20 years ago tonight, said the man, I dined here at Big Joe Brady's with Jimmy Wells, my best chum and the finest chap in the world. He and I were raised here in New York, just like two brothers, together. I was 18 and Jimmy was 20. The next morning, I was to start for the West to make my fortune. You couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on earth. Well, we agreed that night that we would meet here again exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter what our conditions might be or from what distance we might have to come. We figured that in 20 years, each of us ought to have our destiny worked out and our fortunes made, whatever they were going to be. All right, I'm going to ask you guys to do some reading now on your own. You're going to start right here where it says, it sounds pretty interesting. And I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read this section, and I'll try and highlight it on my screen if it will let me. And then I'll have you stop and complete some of the work right here. So I'm going to have you going from all the way to where it goes to good night, sir, that line. So you're going to start right here where it says, it sounds pretty interesting. So these two guys made a promise that in 20 years, they would meet back again and, be able to see how they've done. So right now I'm going to ask you to read this short passage right there to yourself. While you're reading, you are going to encounter corresponded, proposition, and plotter. I want you to do these 3 words in your notes. Take a guess. Don't be afraid to get them wrong. Just give it a shot. What do you think those words mean? And then I also want you to do this next line right here in Making Inferences where it says the man talking about his time out west. And I want you to infer, what can you tell me about this guy based on this line? Okay, so I want you to do those 2 things as you read. So teachers, you're going to go ahead and pause, give students a few minutes to read this and fill in that work. When most are done, go ahead and start the video back up. All right, so as you discovered, this man is here waiting to meet up with his best friend, Jimmy Wells. And according to him, Jimmy Wells would never leave New York. But this guy, he went out west from New York and made his fortune. And he talks all about himself here. So what are some things that you came up with? First off, corresponded. You should have jotted down what you thought corresponded meant. Talking this time frame, corresponded means to communicate. So it's how they communicated. And here in this time frame, they're not communicating on cell phones. They would have been writing letters. Proposition. This man talks about his proposition out there, out west. And you can tell it sounds kind of shady. It's more like a scheme. So his proposition is more like a scheme. And then a little later on, he calls Jimmy a plotter. Compared to him, Jimmy's kind of a plotter. And from what you can tell right there, it means he's not very adventurous. So he's saying Jimmy is not really very adventurous. Now, if your words are pretty similar, your answers are pretty similar to mine, you do not need to change them. If you were way off base, you can go ahead and change them as we practice and continue to work with context clues. So, what did you come up with inferencing, with making an inference here? Based on this line, the man's talking all about himself, and he's like, I hope Jimmy's done half as well. He was kind of a plotter, though. I've had to compete with some of the sharpest wits going to get my pile. So, what could you infer about this guy when he talks about his time out west? Well, right here, he basically says Jimmy's a plotter. So he's saying, that he's pretty adventurous and that he's had to compete with lots of people. So I see this guy as being pretty arrogant. He's pretty full of himself. He's bragging to a police officer about how he's been hustling around trying to make his fortune and how smart he is. So he's pretty full of himself here. He is showing his arrogance as he brags about some of his shady deals to a police officer. So it's quite interesting to see. All right, I'm going to continue to read the story. And while I'm reading, I will let you know when I hit the word astir, and I want you to write down what you think it means. And then we will also have this last one right here, the Jimmy at the end of the story. All right, and so make sure that you're going to be taking notes on those two things. So he asks him right here, if he's going to call time on him sharp, meaning is he going to leave right at 10 o'clock? This is what the officer asks him. And now this man replies, I should say not, says the other. I'll give him half an hour at least. If Jimmy is alive on Earth, he'll be here by that time. So long, officer. Good night, sir, said the policeman, passing along on his beat, trying the doors as he went. There was now a fine, cold drizzle falling, and the wind had risen from its uncertain puffs into a steady blow. The few foot passengers astir in the quarter hurried dismally and silently along with coat collars turned high and pocketed hands. And in the door of the hardware store, a man who had come 1,000 miles to fill an appointment, uncertain almost to absurdity, with a friend of his youth, smoked a cigar and waited. So you can see him just standing there by himself. It's 10 o'clock at night. He's smoking his cigar. It's drizzly, cold. And it says right here, the few foot passengers astir. What do you think astir means? Jot down an answer inside your notes. About 20 minutes he waited, and then a tall man in a long overcoat with the collar turned up to his ears hurried across from the opposite side of the street. And he went directly to the waiting man. Is that you, Bob? He asked doubtfully. Is that you, Jimmy Wells? Cried the man in the door. Bless my heart, exclaimed the new arrival, grasping both the other's hands with his own. It's Bob, sure as fate. I was certain I'd find you here if you were still in existence. Well, 20 years is a long time. The old diner's gone, Bob. I wish it had lasted, so we could have had another dinner there. How has the West treated you, old man? Bully, it's given me everything I've asked it for. You've changed lots, Jimmy. I never thought you were so tall by 2 or 3 inches. I grew a bit after I was 20. Doing well in New York, Jimmy? Moderately. I have a position in one of the city departments. Come on, Bob. We'll go around to a place I know of and have a good long talk about old times. The two men started up the street, arm in arm. The man from the West, his egotism enlarged by success, was beginning to outline the history of his career. The other, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. At the corner store stood a drugstore, brilliant with electric lights. When they came into this glare, each of them turned simultaneously to gaze upon the other's face. The man from the West stopped suddenly and released his arm. You're not Jimmy Wells, he snapped. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change a man's nose from a Roman to a pug. At this point, I am going to ask you to please read to the end of the story. It's just right here. Please read the end of the story and then fill in this last inferencing box where it says Jimmy at the end of the story. I'll see you back in just a few minutes. Okay, you should have silently read that and finished it out. How many of you got it? You figured out what happened at the end. It says Jimmy at the end of the story. It says somehow I couldn't do it myself. So I went around and got a plainclothes man to do the job. Jimmy. So, first off, did you figure out who was Jimmy? If you didn't figure it out, let me tell you. Jimmy was the police officer. He was there the entire time. So if you look right here, the note that was handed to him, it says, Bob, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of the man wanted in Chicago. So right here, Jimmy all of a sudden went, oh, that's my friend Bob? The man is a criminal? So Jimmy was our police officer. So taking a look right here, what does this tell you about Jimmy? What can you infer about Jimmy based upon this when he says, I couldn't do it myself, so I went around and got a plainclothes man to do the job. So Jimmy went and got somebody else to arrest Bob. He just couldn't do it himself. What does that show you? Right here, I think for me, what I can infer about Jimmy is that he's responsible. He knew that Bob needed to be arrested, that Bob was a wanted criminal from out west, and Chicago is west of New York. Another thing it shows me about Jimmy is that he's caring. He cares about his friend, and he couldn't arrest his own friend, but he knew it had to be done. So those are the things that I can infer. Up here, a stir. What did you come up with a stir? If you got moving around, there was nobody astir, there was nobody moving around, there was no movement happening, something like that, then you've got those two. So we should be taking a look at our story here now. All right, so these are some discussion questions to have inside your crew. Did Jimmy show up to meet his friend? And what did Jimmy really do with his life? And we kind of talked about that already. But here's the one that you haven't really talked about. Would you have done the same thing that Jimmy did? Would you have arrested your friend? Would you have had somebody else arrest your friend? What would you have done? So take a few minutes inside your crew today and discuss these 3 questions now that we're done with the story. If there's extra time, feel free to read your independent reading books.